Welcome back to Train Signal's VMware vSphere 5 training. You're watching What's New in vSphere 5 lesson. Alright, so are you guys excited? vSphere 5 is finally here and it is packed with new features. There's over 150 new features in this release and I'm very excited about all of them. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the Top Gun features, the rockstar features of this release. We're going to talk about the vSphere 5 platform enhancements, what's new there, what can I do, how many more VMs per host, etc., etc. We're going to then move on to vSphere storage. There's tons of enhancements as far as vSphere storage is concerned. Now, I'm not going to spoil this, so I'm going to leave it for later slides. We're going to talk about vSphere networking, what's new there, like the ESXi firewall. We're going to talk about vCenter 5 for a little bit. We're going to talk about the new high availability. Yeah, it's been completely re-architected, so I have some slides on there for you as well. Now, vCenter Site Recovery Manager 5, technically it's not part of the course, it's not part of vSphere, but I wanted to also shed some light on it because Site Recovery Manager, or SRM, is such an important feature to all of us. I'm sure you want to learn a little bit more about what's new in SRM 5. vCloud Director 1.5, also a little bit outside of the scope. That with the including vShield 5.0 there, the last three bullets are a little outside of the scope of the course, but I just want to give you a quick overview of what to expect with some of these newer versions. Let's go ahead and get started. vSphere 5 platform enhancements. So the main thing here, the big news here, is what we've been telling you all along. ESX is officially not around anymore. Rest in peace, ESX. ESXi is the new and enhanced generation. So there's a convergence that happened. ESXi moving forward, there's no ESX with this release. Auto Deploy and Image Builder are two of the really cool features in the new vSphere 5 platform. I have some slides on there for you as well. But to give you a brief overview of what Auto Deploy does and what Image Builder does. Today, the way we install ESXi is you probably install it on a USB flash or on the local drive, or it's probably built on a chip on the motherboard somewhere. With Auto Deploy, what it allows you to do is instead of installing these different instances of ESXi, and then every time you want to patch, you patch all of these instances of ESXi, it allows you to boot your physical servers in a stateless mode and sort of download a common image into memory. So think of it this way, you're installing ESXi into memory. So you PXE boot a stateless physical machine, it downloads an image off of the server and it loads it into memory. Now if you wanted to do an upgrade, you upgrade that once, and if you have 10 or 20 ESXi hosts that are connected via that PXE boot and the installation is resident in memory, all it would take on your end is a reboot and all of your ESXi hosts would be up to the latest and greatest from a software patching perspective. Now here's the trick with that. If you patch and all of a sudden you notice that some of the patches are causing issues and you have another maybe image that's still around from an older stable release, swap that out, reboot all your stateless machines, voila, they're all back up to the earlier version that's stable. So it makes provisioning physical ESXi hosts a snap. Now Image Builder is really cool because with ESX, it had a lot of support for a lot of drivers. So typically when you installed ESX on physical hardware, it will detect the network card and fiber channel card, etc., etc. ESXi is a thin install, so it doesn't have all of the drivers typically for all the hardware manufacturers. So what we end up doing is we would have to slipstream the drivers inside of the ISO or the installation in order to get it to work. Image Builder allows us an automated way to slipstream those drivers, get that installation the way we want it, and then create an installation package out of it so that we can customize our installation. So I'll talk about those two features in greater detail as we progress with this lesson. Unified CLI, so with ESXi5, we've unified the command line interface, so you're doing everything through the VMA now. You also have still access to SSH. But you'd have to enable that, and we'll talk about that in greater detail in a little bit. But I wanted to also mention that you have a unified command line interface with this release. VM enhanced capabilities, we'll talk about those in greater details, but what can you do with the VM today? How much memory can you give it? How much CPU? What's new? How many IOPS can you run against it? Etc., etc. Support for up to 160 logical CPUs. So you can have up to 160 logical CPUs in every physical machine that you deploy. That's a monster machine. Up to 2 terabyte of physical memory. That's crazy. I mean, I've put maybe up to 200 gig of memory in a machine, and I thought that was a lot. Maybe 192 is as far as I'd probably ever go. For me, it's just too many eggs in one basket. However, for those of us that are adventurous, you can go all the way up to 2 terabyte physical memory, and ESXi will still understand and see it. Up to 512 virtual machines per host, with a maximum of 2048 vCPUs on that particular host. Host UEFI BIOS, and UEFI stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, and allows you to boot off of local disks, CD-ROM, etc., etc. If you still wanted to boot off of the network, you would still need the old type of BIOS, but you now have support for hosts that have UEFI BIOS within them. And the big news, even though it's sort of limited, but the big news is the ability to virtualize, or to officially virtualize, Mac OS X 10.6, aka Snow Leopard Guest OS within a VM. Now, granted, there's a caveat there that you only can run it on Apple hardware, and that hardware is the Xserve 3.1 system. So there are some limitations, but hey, we're making progress. It's in the right direction, so we should all have a big smile on our face. Hopefully the next release, Apple will relax some of their licensing requirements so that we can virtualize it on anything we want. Now, with regards to improved SNMP support, we can now support the converting CIM indicators to SNMP traps as well. So tons of new features from a vSphere 5 platform perspective. Okay, vSphere storage, my favorite topic. Now, this is funny because about 5 years ago, if you'd asked me about storage, it meant nothing to me. 5 or 6 years ago, I didn't care about storage. With the advent of virtualization, I am so intrigued with storage now. It's such a cool, so many cool features here. So what's new? Well, storage DRS, SDRS. Most of you have probably heard about that. We've been doing regular DRS for the most part since ESX came onto the market from an enterprise perspective. And DRS allowed you to load balance your cluster, the VMs that are in your cluster, based on the CPU and memory usage of the hosts that are members of that cluster. So today with storage DRS, you can now also load balance the virtual machines based on the data stores that they're on. So if a data store is running low on disk space, or if there's high latency against that data store, well, storage DRS is going to detect that, and then it's going to move virtual machines off of that data store onto another data store, thereby load balancing all of your data stores so that they can perform better and that they can offer adequate storage to the virtual machines. Now, obviously, storage DRS is going to be handled via storage vMotion, and we'll talk about that again in greater detail in a second here. Profile-driven storage is another very, very cool feature. What profile-driven storage allows you to do is it allows you to put SLAs against certain virtual machines. So if you have different tiers of data store within your environment, SSD, SAS, SATA, etc., and you want certain virtual machines to always be on SSD, or you want them to be on SSD most of the time and sometimes they can go to SAS, profile-driven storage will guarantee that certain virtual machines meet certain SLAs from a storage perspective, and it ties that into with storage vMotion and VASA, and we'll talk about those in greater detail in a second here as well. VMFS 5, so there's a new version of the VM file system, or the VMware file system. So it goes from version 3 to version 5. I'm going to talk about some of the enhancements. vSphere APIs for storage awareness, VASA. So VASA is typically used in conjunction with profile-driven storage. What VASA allows you to do, it creates APIs for storage vendors that allows the storage vendor to tie into vCenter, so that vCenter understands the underlying storage. So VASA, in essence, exposes the capabilities of the storage array to Virtual Center, and at that point Virtual Center can take these capabilities and can use things like profile-driven storage to make sure that virtual machines are always on the most appropriate data store based on the requirements and the rules that you put in place. There are enhancements to vSphere APIs for array integration, VAI. Most of you are probably familiar with VAI. One of the biggest enhancements, and we'll talk about that as well, is it now supports NFS, whereas before it was just fiber channel. vSphere Storage Appliance, or VSA, now allows you to virtualize local disk and some type of network disk as well, and deliver that to your ESXi host as shared storage. So big enhancement there. iSCSI UI support, so there's enhancements to how you can configure iSCSI from a user interface perspective. Storage I/O control for NFS. So typically, storage I/O was available for Fiber Channel, including network I/O, as we're going to see in the next slide. Those were typically available only to the Fiber Channel world. They are now available to NFS as well. Swap to SSD is one of my favorite new storage features. So swap to SSD allows the ESX host, allows the VM kernel to be aware of any SSD that is either local or on the network. And what happens when ESXi or the VM kernel is aware of the SSD that is available to it, either via the network or local, it will extend the host swap files, all the swap operations, to SSD, and this allows you for memory overcommitment and all sorts of stuff, because now you're swapping to SSD, so the performance isn't degraded. Swap to SSD is hands down one of my coolest features of vSphere 5. I really like it. Storage vMotion snapshot support. So now you can snapshot, or you can storage vMotion snapshotted VMs, and you can storage vMotion snapshotted VMs that also have snapshots. So VMs with snapshots, in essence, in English, can be storage vMotion now. VMware View Accelerator. I might be exaggerating if I said this is probably my favorite feature. So VMware View Accelerator allows you to cache a local copy of the master image. So if you're in a view environment and you have these master images that you use linked clones off of, typically those get hammered as new virtual machines are spun up or powered on. All those reads go against that. So if you have 10 ESX hosts, one shared storage, that particular shared storage is getting hammered from all 10 ESX hosts, thereby contributing to logon storms and boot up storms, etc. VMware View Accelerator, what it does is it's going to cache certain amounts of that master image locally on the host, and you can determine how much of that master image to cache locally, so that when the VMs that are local to that host are booting up, they are getting their initial bits from the local host, thereby avoiding all of these unnecessary boot up storms and performance degradation, and the VMs will boot significantly faster, and then they will revert back to the shared storage for normal operations. Fantastic new feature. Unfortunately, it's not supported with the current version of VMware View, and at this moment it's 4.6. We're hoping that with VMware View 5 this will also be a supported configuration. vSphere networking. Alright, so the same thing with storage I/O, where it was extended to NFS. Now network I/O is also extended to NFS, and you have a lot of enhancements to guarantee quality of service for certain virtual machines that you might want to give more or less attention to. vNetwork distributed switch improvements. There's a lot of enhancements and improvements and granular control over what you can and cannot do from a vNetwork distributed switch perspective, and we're going to get into that when we talk about networking. ESX Firewall is probably one of the cooler features. It allows you to create a firewall that is a very, very stateless or very lightweight firewall for ESXi. And let me show you where it is. So if we switch to the GUI here real quick, if we go under Hosts and Clusters and you select the actual physical host that you have, click on Configuration, under the Security Profile, you'll notice that you have the firewall here and a very small summary of what's going on, etc., etc. If you wanted to modify any of these, obviously you would go into Properties and you uncheck, select what you want. You can control which incoming IP addresses have access to it or not. We're going to get into ESXi Firewall in greater detail in a later lesson, but I wanted to show you where it's at. Alright, moving on to vCenter 5.0. So from a vCenter 5.0 perspective, you can still do a traditional install. Just bring up a virtual machine, install Virtual Center. That's the traditional Windows install approach. Or you can now download a vCenter Linux appliance. If you don't want to waste a Windows server license on vCenter, for example, you can always download it as an appliance, install it in your infrastructure, and voila, you're up and running in no time. You have access to the vSphere full client, and you have access to the vSphere web client. The vSphere web client has been significantly enhanced. It's not just about powering up or powering down virtual machines for the most part. It is a fully usable and functional web client. Now, granted, you still can't do everything that you can do with the full client, but it is significantly improved from what you can do with prior versions. Now, my only disappointment here is it's not HTML5. I would have loved for this particular client to be HTML5 compliant, but we are definitely getting there. Enhanced logging support, so you can do much more from a logging perspective when it comes to vCenter 5 in this release. All right, so what are the enhancements to the virtual machines? What can you do from a VM perspective? So in order to take advantage of everything that vSphere 5 offers, you obviously have to upgrade the virtual machine hardware to version 8. So version 8 is the key to unlocking all of these cool features that we're going to talk about. So if it wasn't enough for you, you can now have up to 32 vCPUs, including multi-core support, within your virtual machine. And speaking of multi-core, let's go ahead and switch back to Virtual Center. Let me show you where it's at and how cool it is. It's basically the same thing. So if you guys are familiar with VMware Workstation, how you configure multi-core there, it's the same place. So let me show you. So I have FS01 here. If we right-click on FS01 and drag down to Edit Settings, you'll notice that under vCPUs, you now have sort of two tabs. So I only have one vCPU here and one core, but I can also increase the cores that I want, etc., etc. So it's a very simple GUI approach to how you do certain things. All right, so if RAM is a problem and you don't have enough RAM for your virtual machines, up to 1 terabyte of virtual RAM can now be applied to your virtual machines. This is more than what I've seen in physical hosts. Literally, the virtual machine hardware is going to surpass what we've installed over all of our careers inside of each server. It's kind of ridiculous. You can support up to 1 million IOPS per VM. That is insane capabilities for a virtual machine. Stuff I wouldn't dreamt of, 5 or 6 years ago to tell me we were going to get to a day where I can assign a terabyte of RAM to a virtual machine. Really? I would have never guessed that. Support for client-side connected USB and USB 3.0 support. So this is a little bit misleading, so I just want to make sure you understand this and smart card reader support. So while vSphere 5 is extending support to these USB devices, they're extending them only to the client that is running the vSphere client. So you can put a USB device in the back of your laptop, for example, or in the backup of your desktop, and if you're running the vSphere client or the vSphere web client from this laptop or desktop, then you can extend support to the VM that way. But you can't still put a USB device or a smart card reader, for that matter, in the back of an ESXi server and extend it to your, or pass it through to the VMs. So there's still a limitation, but definitely a welcome step in the right direction. Non-hardware accelerated 3D graphics support. This is cool, especially for VMware view environments where you now have access to Windows Aero without needing hardware-assisted support to give you that type of functionality. So definitely very cool stuff. Again, the same thing as with the host BIOS support for UEFI. You now have also support for UEFI virtual BIOS at the VM level as well. VMware Tools version support matrix. This is pretty cool because the new version of VMware Tools is now probably version 5X. Now version 5X, if you've installed it on a VM and you're taking that VM from ESXi 5 to ESX or ESXi 4.x, the VMware Tools version is compatible. It's backward compatible, but the cool thing is it's also forward compatible. So any ESXi or ESX 4.0 VMware Tools can also be run on 5 and vice versa. So the versions here is pretty cool because it's backwards and forwards compatible. So it gives you some configuration or some handle on it. GUI configuration for multi-core vCPUs. I showed you where that's at. Mac OS X. Again, I didn't know if to keep that under the platform support or under the VM support, so I just wanted to make mention of it in both places so that you know that you can now virtualize Mac OS X 10.6 Snow Leopard as a guest operating system on your virtual machines. Auto deploy and image builder. So we talked a little bit about auto deploy and image builder, but how do you really use auto deploy and image builder, and what's the purpose of it? So if you're going more towards cloud computing, and the whole theme behind vSphere 5 is that VMware wants to make vSphere 5 as the cloud operating system. So you want to be able to orchestrate most of your functions. It's all about automation and orchestration and fast provisioning. Auto deploy, image builder, in conjunction with what you already know from a host profiles perspective, can take a stateless physical machine, deploy ESXi on it, using an image that you've created using Image Builder, and then using host profiles, add it to Virtual Center, add it in the right cluster, apply all the necessary rules against it, and put it in production. So you go from just regular physical hardware to a fully functional, usable ESXi host within a matter of minutes. That's the idea behind Auto Deploy and Image Builder. So Image Builder, you're going to use that to create the correct image for the hardware platform that you have. So if you have Dell, Cisco, and IBM or HP blades in your environment, you create an image for every one of them, and every one of those images will have the right drivers in it. You can configure Auto Deploy so that if you've created, let's simplify this and say you've created a subnet for the Dell servers and a subnet for IBM and HP, etc. So there's a range of IP addresses. If Auto Deploy detects that a certain host was plugged into any one of those ranges, it will deploy a specific image. So if you have a range for the Cisco servers and a range for the HP servers, depending on where it detects the IP is coming from, it will deliver the correct image. So you've gotten it to the point where all you have to do is plug it into the network, and it's going to deploy the right image. That image will be streamed into memory, so it will be memory resident on that ESXi server. So it's not installed locally anymore. It's resident inside of the VM, so it's very fast performance. And because ESXi is such a small footprint install, you can afford to do that. So it pixie boots, gets its IP address, gets its right image, voila, within a matter of minute, it boots right away into ESXi. Host profiles assigns it into Virtual Center, into the right cluster, and you are in production. Auto Deploy and Image Builder significantly enhances productivity, centralization, and management. And if you wanted to do any kind of an update, you update that vDisk, reboot the ESXi hosts, and voila, you now have a patched ESXi within a matter of minutes. Fantastic stuff with Auto Deploy. Storage DRS. Hands down, Eli's favorite feature of vSphere 5, I'm going on the record, is storage DRS. I'm as excited about storage DRS as I was excited about vMotion when it first came out. The ability to load balance your virtual machines across the most appropriate data store is fantastic, and you're obviously doing that with storage vMotion. So it also does initial VM placement. So the same way as with regular DRS, when the machine first powers on, it's going to place it on the most appropriate host based on CPU and memory. With initial VM placement, it's going to place it, or it's going to move it to the most appropriate data store based on the utilization of the other data stores. Now, the way it automatically load balances across data stores is based on storage space utilization and the lowest latency. So it's going to continually try to move virtual machines across all the data stores that it has access to based on these two criteria. But you also have affinity rules and anti-affinity rules. Affinity rules are really cool. So in some cases, you might allow the virtual machine, certain VMDKs of the virtual machines, to be storage vMotioned off to a different data store if they're being hammered. So SDRS is going to take a look and say, okay, FSO1 is a VM and it has 3 VMDK files. 2 of the VMDK files are fine. They can continue to stay on this data store, but this third VMDK is being hammered very much. I'm going to move it off of this data store to another data store. Now you can do it in a way where if you're creating affinity and anti-affinity rules, where you say, I always want all the VMDKs to move with the VM. So if you're going to storage vMotion something as part of SDRS, you move everything. Or you can allow it to move certain aspects of the VMDKs and leave certain other aspects. Now in some cases, you might want to do what's known as VM anti-affinity rules. And that's cool, because sometimes you want to put the VMX or the configuration files, the log files of a VM, you want to put them on cheap disk, right? You probably want to put them on SATA, for example, SATA drives. You don't necessarily want them to participate in storage DRS. It's unnecessary. So what you do with VM anti-affinity is you're telling it, look, don't move my configuration files, but you can go ahead and move all my VMDKs however way you want. So you have granular control over where the VM configuration files are, and you can pin them down to a particular data store if that makes sense. Very cool stuff with SDRS. Profile-driven storage. Profile-driven storage is going to match the storage capabilities that you have within the environment to the VM storage requirements. So you might come in and say, look, I have this domain controller, or I have the SQL server, and my SLAs on it are very high. I want to make sure that it's always on the fast types of disk, etc., etc. What you use is you leverage VASA, storage APIs for array awareness. VASA, if the storage array can handle it or has written code for it, will expose the capabilities of the storage to vCenter. So vCenter is going to know immediately, okay, I have SSD capabilities, I have SAS capabilities. These are the underlying capabilities of my storage. And then based on the SLAs that you put around certain virtual machines, it will match those requirements to the most suited data store that it has available to it. Now, because VASA is a relatively new API, storage API, and because a lot of storage vendors probably haven't written any APIs to it, you can manually tag each data store. So after you create a data store, you can go to that data store and say SSD or say SAS. Just give it a tag so that vCenter understands the different tiers that it has, and as a result can then move the virtual machine or assign the virtual machine to the most appropriate data store available. Now, the other advantage of profile-driven storage is that it will continuously monitor the virtual machine to make sure it's meeting those SLAs. So it's going to continually monitor it and make sure it doesn't go from a tier 1 to a tier 3 data store. So let's switch over to vCenter and let me show you where you can configure profile-driven storage. So if you go up to Home here and find VM Storage Profiles, you're able to configure the different storage profiles that you have access to from this particular wizard. So all you have to do here is come to Create, give it a name, give it a description. Let's do SAS, for example. You click on Next. If the vCenter, if the storage that you're using has the VASA APIs, it's going to expose the data stores. You're going to see them here. You can configure the data stores manually as well, and we're going to talk about that in later lessons, how you can configure those. But they'll be here, they'll be available to you. You can select them and go through the wizard and create these profiles that you can then assign to your virtual machines. Very cool stuff. VMFS5. I kind of left this on purpose in the middle of the presentation just to tick you guys off because I know everybody's waiting for this. So yes, the highlight of this is you no longer have a 2 terabyte limitation on VMFS volume. You now have a 64 terabyte limitation on a VMFS volume. Good luck filling that up. 64 terabyte for me, at least in this day and age, is more than enough for a single volume. I don't even want to fill that up with virtual machines, but you now have 2 terabyte VMFS volumes. The other very interesting thing here is space reclamation for thin provision LUNs. So with the use of VAAI, you now can do automatic space reclamation. So you no longer have to run scripts or deal with this in any manual format. If you're using thin provision disk and you have VAAI enabled, it will automatically reclaim all that space that is being that hasn't been reclaimed manually yet. So it'll automatically reclaim that. So tons of new features here from a VMFS perspective, and I've given you a quick comparison between VMFS 3 and VMFS 5, what you can and cannot do. VMware View Accelerator. Yeah, my favorite feature. So again, I went into this into details. The thing to note here is while View Accelerator is a hypervisor feature, it can only go into effect, it'll only work if VMware View supports it. So you want to make sure that the VMware View version that you're using can support the accelerator, because controlling the amount of cache that each ESXi host is going to keep for its particular master image is controlled from the VMware View composer. So again, instead of having a master image that's on shared disk and all the ESX hosts are going to pound that particular image, you are caching bits of that particular master image on each ESXi host. Thereby, when the virtual machines on that ESXi host boot, they are going to boot to the locally cached image first, thereby significantly reducing your reliance on shared storage and the requirements for beefy and hefty storage to support all those VDI environments that you have set up. This significantly reduces your CapEx savings and enhances your OpEx functionality and savings as well. The new high availability. My second favorite feature. My first is storage DRS. My second is definitely HA. So traditionally, HA was in the form of a primary-secondary approach within the cluster. Today, HA is more of a master-slave approach within the cluster. So there's only one master within the cluster, and this master is determined by holding an election every time the servers reboot, etc., etc. An election is held, and a master server, one ESXi host out of the others, becomes the master. All of the rest are slaves. And it's built off of what's known as an FDM manager, or a fault domain manager. Fault domain manager master becomes the master servers. Everything else is the slave in this particular environment. The enhancement here, the Top Gun capability is traditional HA. It used to detect a failure using the management network. So if it can't communicate, if it loses the heartbeat with the management network, it will automatically declare that host failed, and it will start its regular processes. Now, we all know that that's not enough. In a lot of cases, the virtual machine network is fine. Maybe a cable was yanked. Something happened, but the server, in essence, is still up and running. So in order to provide more resilience, more redundancy, and an additional layer, the VMs aren't going to be checked just via the management network now. They're also going to be checked via storage. So HA is going to communicate with these VMs via the storage communication path, and if it notices that these VMs are still up and running and functioning, it's not going to declare a failure on that particular host. So now you have dual layers of communication to detect a failure within the host. You also have one log file per server now, and it's located in etc, OPT, VMware, FDM, so you can find that file very, very easily. There's no more reliance on DNS, so for the most part, we've removed that, or VMware's removed that prerequisite for DNS. So that eliminates a lot of common issues. There's IPv6 support now. I don't know how many of you are using IPv6, but hey, there's support for it. And the last two bullets are my favorites. Now, those are taken from some of the slides at VMware. And I find them funny because it says enhanced UI and enhanced deployment. now, I don't know about you guys, but when we do HA and we're going to go through it, and David and I are probably one of us going to go through this setup, there's not really that much to configure. So I really don't know what they mean by enhanced UI or enhanced deployment. But let's go ahead and switch to our virtual center and take a look at how difficult it is to deploy HA very quickly. So back here, if I right click on my HA DRS cluster and we drag down to edit settings, wow, it's very difficult. It is now enabled, so that's from enabling HA perspective, and then you just go through and configure the necessary settings that you need for this particular cluster. So when VMware says enhanced or enabled, I just find it funny because it was always simple. On to vCenter Site Recovery Manager SRM5. Now again, this is a little bit outside of the scope of what we're talking about, but I wanted to make you aware of some of the features because I know a lot of you will be interested in this. So a lot of us complain about SRM because you always needed a third-party product for replication. Now, VMware kind of spoiled us. We expected things that we wanted to be part of the product. So for those of you that have been doing hypervisor-based replication is now supported. So you now have kind of the equivalent of the Veeam replicator or the Vision Core / Quest vReplicator, where it's storage agnostic. It doesn't care about local or shared storage, or if it's EMC to EMC or Hitachi to Hitachi. It is hypervisor-based replication that you can do between your hosts. And this is a great enhancement, especially for Site Recovery Manager 5, because now you don't need the reliance of the array to do the replication or third party. Again, it's built in. So it's bundled with SRM. Now, keep in mind when you're doing hypervisor-based replication with SRM, it's file level consistency. So if you are doing this against a SQL server, an Exchange server, an Active Directory server, those are going to be crash consistent replication. I don't recommend you do these types of application using file level consistency because the reliability of that image, if it's not done properly on the other side, will cause a lot of issues and would have to be rebuilt from logs, etc., etc. So be aware of the file level replication that SRM does. Now, it does offer application consistent replication, but it will only offer that in a planned migration. So if you're setting up SRM, there is a way to set up planned migration, and only when you're doing a planned migration will you be able to do application consistent migrations. So pay attention when you're doing any of these application or database specific servers that you use planned migration rather than just the plain vanilla that comes out of the box. It also obviously still has support for storage-based replication, so it can very easily tie into that. Now the great thing about SRM is it did fail over very well in all of its versions. But if you're like me and you've ever used SRM, failback was always a pain in the neck. So one of the cool things about SRM5 is now we have automated failback, and the failback process has been significantly enhanced to where it is a fully functional and usable product. It can leverage, when you fail over, you're declaring that the first site is done, is gone. Now when you go to fail back, you want to make sure that can I leverage anything that's still there? Can I take advantage of anything, any data that's still there? So they've significantly enhanced the awareness of SRM5. Now also I wanted to mention that it's also IP version v6 capable, just in case you were doing that. vCloud Director, again, significant improvement here. I've mentioned all of the stuff that you can do. The most important thing here to note that all of you are probably going to be looking for is now you can do linked clones, the same linked clones that you can do in VMware View and VMware Workstation, etc. You can do those with ESX i5 if you're using vCloud Director 1.5, so that it significantly improves your provisioning time, etc., etc. So link clones are now available. Microsoft SQL Server support. These are some of the highlights of vCloud Director that I am interested in, and that I'm sure you guys will be particularly interested in. And I've listed some of the other things that you have that you can get here. vShield 5 is great. For those of you that are using VDI environments, if you're not using vShield Endpoint, I think you're missing out. One of the things that you have to pay attention to and note significantly is that, look, you cannot treat your virtual environment the same way that you treat your physical environment. So you cannot import all the processes, everything that you've been doing in the physical environment, import that into the virtual environment. It's a different entity. It's a different animal. In the physical environment, every server was, for the most part, a standalone entity. It had its own resources, its own CPU, its own memory, for the most part, its own local disk. And even when you provision SanDisk, you're provisioning that shared storage to a particular host for that particular application. So for SQL, you were provisioning LUNs for that box. So it was very siloed. When you move into the virtual world, it's all about shared resources. It's all about doing more with less. So with vShield Endpoint, you want to be able to remove the antivirus agent out of every virtual machine in the environment and offload that onto an appliance so that the underlying storage doesn't get grilled. The idea of agent-based approach in a virtual environment is ludicrous. In the physical world, it worked fine because, again, you had enough hardware, it was isolated to that box, that was the right approach. We are moving from a siloed approach to a shared approach. If you have 400 virtual machines and everyone has an agent, every time you're running a scan at noon, it's going to grill the underlying hardware. So you're going to go out and buy more storage. So the idea here is, are you going to go out and buy storage to support the load, and then every time you add more VMs, you're going to buy more storage? Or you're going to do this in a better way. You're going to take the agent out, offload it to an appliance, and pay a little extra in licensing, but it's justifiable compared to what you're going to do to the storage and scale. Scaling the storage is not just the cost of the storage, it's also putting the storage, it's the footprint, it's how much data center space, etc., etc. So I would rather offload that to soft costs than increase my footprint in the data center. So pay attention to that. vShield will also do data security, not just against the perimeter, the edge, which is what we have, but it'll also do it against specific applications that you can isolate. So think of vShield 5 moving forward as the framework, the security framework that secures your cloud environment moving forward. Very, very cool stuff here. All right, so what have we covered? This was a cool lesson. I hope you got a lot of good information, a lot of good insights into some of the new features of vSphere 5. We spoke about the vSphere 5 platform enhancements. So now you can put 160 logical CPUs up to 2048 vCPUs inside of one particular host. We discussed the Mac OS X support now. So a lot of platform enhancements, convergence, no more ESX, it's all ESXi now. We talked about vSphere storage. We covered the vSphere storage appliance. We talked about VASA, the vSphere storage APIs for array awareness. We talked about profile-driven storage. We talked about storage DRS, etc., etc. So we covered a lot within vSphere storage. We also talked about vSphere networking and discussed how now you have the network I/O extended, enhanced features to extend to NFS. We talked about the vDistributed switches. We talked about ESXi firewall. vCenter 5, we covered the fact that you can now get it in a Linux appliance if you don't want to waste a Windows server license on it, but you can still install it traditionally within a Windows operating system. We also talked about the full client and the fact that you now have a more granular, more useful web client that you can use. We talked about the new high availability HA. It's been redesigned, reconstructed from the ground up, so there's no more concept of primary secondary. It's more now of a master-slave relationship. One server, one ESXi host within the cluster will be elected master, everyone else is slave. We talked about how a failure is detected and the fact that it's not just through the management network anymore, but rather it has a second tier to verify if there was a failure by going through the storage communication and verifying that as well. We talked about vCenter Site Recovery Manager and the fact that it used to do failover very well but not necessarily fail back. We talked about hypervisor level replication, file level replication versus a planned migration, which offers you an application level consistency for your replication. We talked about vCloud Director. And some of the cool features there were the fact that you can now do linked clones using ESXi 5 and vSphere 5. So the same concept that you had with VMware Workstation, you now have with vSphere 5. Same thing with VMware View. So they're bringing sort of these functionalities that we liked in some of the other products into vCloud Director. vShield 5, we talked about the endpoint, the app, and the edge, and the fact that you shouldn't be treating all of your applications the way you're treating them in the physical world, you're treating them in the virtual world, and you need a new way of addressing things, a new way of thinking about things. Finally, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.